I didn't do nothing!
Stop walking! Stop now! Get on the ground! Do it now!
You did back up and route.
Don't run! Stop! Taser! Taser! Get on the ground!
A convenience store at 11:47 on a rainy Wednesday night. Red and blue lights strobing across wet pavement. A body cam shaking as an officer runs toward the entrance. A metal display rack tipped over near the doorway. Snacks scattered across the tile floor. A frightened clerk behind the counter. And a man in a dark hoodie backing toward the parking lot exit with wide, anxious eyes. 30 seconds later, that man was on the wet pavement outside with taser probes in his torso and the electricity still cycling. What the body camera showed looked like a straightforward use of force incident. A subject destroying a store, an officer responding, a chase, a taser, standard procedure. What the body camera did not show was what the store clerk had been trying to say from the moment the officer walked through the door. What she had been shouting, not in panic at the man in the hoodie, but at the officer approaching him. 3 words that the body cam audio picked up clearly, but that nobody listened to until the footage was reviewed 48 hours later. He needs help. Not he is dangerous, not stop him, not call for backup. He needs help. Because the man backing toward the parking lot in a dark hoodie on a rainy Wednesday night was not a vandal. He was not a criminal. He had no weapon. He had no intention. He had a diagnosis that his family had been managing for 6 years, and a prescription that he had not been able to fill for 11 days, and a brain that had been in a state of acute psychiatric crisis for the past 4 hours before he wandered into that convenience store and his body started doing things that terrified him as much as it terrified everyone watching. His name is Raymond Okafor. He is 34 years old. And when the full story came out, when the clerk gave her statement and the medical records were reviewed and the 11 days without medication were documented, the question 30 million people asked was not whether the taser should have been deployed. The question was whether Officer Brett Saunders had taken a single second to ask why before he reached for his belt. He had not. And that single second, that one question never asked, is what ended his career, cost the city $1.6 million, and changed the way an entire police department trains its officers to walk through a door. Let me know in the comments what city or country you are watching from, and if this is your first time here, subscribe right now because what happened to Raymond Okafor outside that convenience store is not a story about a dangerous man who needed to be stopped. It is a story about a sick man who needed to be seen, and about the difference between those two things and what happens when the person with the badge cannot tell them apart. This is the full story from the beginning. The Valero station on Crescent Boulevard is the kind of place that exists at the edge of every American city, open 24 hours, fluorescent lit, slightly worn at the corners from years of overnight shifts and minimum wage and the particular exhaustion of a business that never closes. 3 pumps under a narrow canopy, a small attached convenience store with a glass front door and a counter positioned so the clerk can see the entire interior without moving. Security cameras at 2 angles inside and 1 above the entrance outside. Wet pavement on this particular Wednesday because it had been raining since 4 in the afternoon and showed no sign of stopping. The clerk on duty that night is a 26-year-old woman named Sandra Reeves, who has worked the 11 to 7 shift at this location for 2.5 years. She knows her regulars. She knows the rhythms of a late-night shift, who comes in for energy drinks at midnight, who comes in for cigarettes at 2, what a normal Wednesday looks like and what a not normal Wednesday looks like. Raymond Okafor had come through the door at approximately 11:39. She noticed him immediately, not because of anything threatening, but because she recognized the signs. She had a younger brother with bipolar disorder, and she had spent enough of her life watching a person she loved move through the world with a brain that sometimes turned against him to know what acute psychiatric distress looks like when it walks through a door.
Raymond was not moving right. His eyes were scanning too fast. His hands were doing something restless at his sides, opening and closing without purpose. He walked the length of the snack aisle once and then again in the opposite direction. He picked up a bag of chips and put it back in the wrong place. He said something under his breath that Sandra could not hear from the counter, but that was clearly not directed at anyone in the store. She had reached for her phone. Not to call the police, to call his family. She did not have his family's number. She did not know who he was, but she was looking for a way to help him that did not involve the next option, which she was already afraid of, because she had seen enough to know how those options tended to end for a black man in a dark hoodie in the fluorescent light of a late-night convenience store when somebody called for help, and the help that arrived came with a badge and a belt and no training in the difference between a threat and a crisis. She was still holding her phone when Raymond's hand caught the edge of the snack display stand and it went over. It was not a violent movement. Watching the store's interior security footage later, the investigators would note that the stand went over because Raymond's hand struck it while he was pacing, not because he threw it or pushed it deliberately. The sound was loud. Bags of chips and candy bars and bottled drinks scattered across the tile. Raymond stopped walking and looked at the mess on the floor with an expression that Sandra would later describe as somebody who had just come back into themselves for a moment and was horrified by what they were seeing. She came out from behind the counter. She said his name. She did not know his name. She said, "Hey, look at me. It is okay. Let me help you." He turned toward her voice. That was when the patrol car pulled into the lot. Officer Brett Saunders is 28 years old and has been with the city police department for 3 years. His training record includes a 4-hour module on crisis intervention training, the standard curriculum designed to help officers recognize and respond appropriately to individuals experiencing mental health emergencies. 4 hours in 3 years. That module is the entirety of the formal mental health training he received before walking through the door of the Valero on Crescent Boulevard at 11:47 on a Wednesday night. He had received a call about a male subject actively destroying a convenience store. He arrived to find a tipped-over display rack visible through the glass door, items scattered on the floor, and a clerk who appeared distressed. He got out of his car and ran toward the entrance. Sandra saw him coming. She moved toward the door to meet him before he came inside. This is the moment the body cam captures that no one focused on in the first 48 hours of the footage being reviewed, because in the first 48 hours, everyone was watching the end of the footage. But Sandra Reeves is visible in the frame, moving toward the door, her mouth already open, already speaking, already trying to tell the officer approaching her what she needed him to know before he came inside. The body cam audio picks up fragments of what she says. The phrase, "he is not," is audible. The phrase, "he needs," is audible. The word, "help," is audible. Saunders moves past her into the store. Inside, Raymond is standing near the far end of the aisle. He has not moved toward the door. He has not attempted to leave. He is standing with his back partially to the entrance and his hands visible at his sides and his eyes moving in that too fast way that Sandra had noticed when he first came in. Saunders shouts, "Sir, hands where I can see them." Raymond turns. His hands are already visible. They have been visible, but the shout, the sudden, loud, authoritative voice in a brain that is already in crisis, produces a response that has nothing to do with guilt and everything to do with fear. His eyes go wide. His body begins moving backward toward the rear of the store, toward the parking lot exit, the movement of someone who is frightened and whose instinct in that moment is to create distance from the source of the fear. To Saunders, it looks like a subject attempting to evade. "I didn't do nothing." The words come out in the voice of someone who is not entirely present, not slurred, not aggressive, the voice of someone speaking from inside a state that is difficult to describe if you have not witnessed it, the particular quality of a person who is trying very hard to connect their words to the situation in front of them and finding the connection unreliable. "Stop walking. Stop now." Sandra is in the doorway behind Saunders. The body cam footage shows her at the edge of the frame. Her mouth is still moving. Her hands are out. She is trying to get into the officer's field of attention without stepping in front of him because she understands intuitively that stepping in front of him at this moment will make things worse. Raymond reaches the rear exit and pushes through it into the parking lot. The wet pavement, the reflected strobing lights, the rain still coming down in a fine mist that makes the ground slick and turns every surface into a mirror for the red and blue. The timestamp reads 23:47:31. Sandra Reeves is standing in the doorway of the Valero. The body cam footage shows her in the background, her hand over her mouth, watching. Raymond O'Coffer's family received a call at 12:19 in the morning. His sister, who is 31 years old and who has been the primary person in his life responsible for managing his treatment and medication and the particular logistics of caring for someone whose illness is serious and chronic and periodically catastrophic, answered on the second ring because she had been awake. She had been awake because Raymond had not come home, and she had been calling his phone for 2 hours, and he had not been answering.
She drove to the hospital. He had a laceration on the left side of his head from the curb, a concussion. Minor burns at both taser probe contact points. The treating physician noted that taser deployment on wet pavement presents an elevated conduction risk and that the patient had been fortunate that the current path had not passed through cardiac tissue in a way that caused lasting arrhythmia. He was admitted to the psychiatric unit at 7 the following morning after the emergency department cleared his physical injuries. His sister sat with him through the night. She did not leave to call a lawyer until he was stable. The lawyer she called is a civil rights attorney named Christopher Adeyemi, who had been practicing in Florida for 14 years and who had represented 9 clients in cases involving the intersection of law enforcement and psychiatric crisis. He listened to the sister's account and asked 2 questions. Was there body camera footage, and was there a store clerk who had witnessed the encounter from the beginning? There was footage. There was a clerk. He took the case. The open records request produced the body cam footage 11 days later. Adeyemi watched it 4 times. Then he obtained the store's interior security footage from the convenience store's corporate security office, which had preserved it in response to an inquiry letter he sent the same day as the open records request. The interior footage showed the full 12 minutes from the moment Raymond walked through the door to the moment Saunders entered, and it showed something the body cam had not captured, which was Sandra Reeves standing behind the counter for the first 8 of those 12 minutes, watching Raymond move through the store, not reaching for a phone to call for help, but holding her phone and visibly deciding not to call. She had not called the police. Someone else had. A customer who had been in the store for approximately 90 seconds when the display stand went over, who had seen a man in a dark hoodie with the display rack on the floor, who had not seen the 8 minutes before that, who had no context for what they were witnessing and had stepped outside and called 911 and described a male subject actively destroying the store. Saunders had arrived with that description and no other information. Adeyemi did not minimize this in his complaint. He noted it precisely, because the precision mattered. Saunders had arrived with incomplete information. That was not Saunders's fault. What was Saunders's fault, and what the complaint documented in careful detail across 41 pages, was what Saunders had done with the incomplete information, which was to advance through it at full speed without pausing for a single second to gather more. Sandra Reeves had been at the door. She had been speaking. The body cam audio proved she had been speaking, and the body cam footage proved that Saunders had moved past her without stopping to hear what she was saying. That decision, the decision to move past the person with the most information rather than stopping for 10 seconds to obtain it, was the decision that put Raymond Okafor on wet pavement with a concussion and taser burns and a psychiatric crisis that had been escalated by the encounter into something that would take 4 months of intensive treatment to stabilize. The internal affairs investigation concluded in 29 days. The findings were specific. Saunders had failed to conduct any pre-contact assessment of the subject's possible mental health status, despite visible behavioral indicators documented in the store's own security footage. He had failed to utilize crisis intervention training protocols at any point during the encounter. He had deployed a taser against a subject who was not in possession of a weapon, had not made physical contact with the officer, and whose attempt to move away from the officer was documented on wet pavement in conditions that elevated the risk of deployment-related injury. And he had advanced past a witness who was actively attempting to provide information relevant to the subject's condition, a failure that the investigation characterized as a critical missed opportunity for de-escalation. The disciplinary board recommended termination. The chief approved it. Saunders was terminated after 3 years of service. His state law enforcement certification was referred for review. The certification board reviewed the footage and the investigation findings and voted to revoke his certification permanently. The criminal referral came from the state attorney's office 36 days after the incident. Saunders was charged with aggravated battery under color of authority. The charge carried a sentencing range of 2 to 5 years under Florida statutes. His attorney sought a plea arrangement. The state attorney offered a reduced charge with a 2-year minimum. The defense accepted. Saunders was sentenced to 2 years in state prison, followed by 2 years of supervised release with a prohibition on employment in any law enforcement or security capacity. The civil settlement was reached 3 months after the sentencing. The city agreed to pay Raymond Okafor $1,600,000. The settlement also required the police department to expand its crisis intervention training from 4 hours to 40 hours for all officers, with mandatory annual refresher training thereafter. It required the creation of a co-responder program pairing officers with licensed mental health clinicians for calls involving possible psychiatric emergencies. It required a revision to dispatch protocols to include mental health screening questions when calls involve behavioral disturbance without reports of weapons or physical violence. And it required the department to report publicly on a quarterly basis the number of calls involving mental health crisis and the outcomes of those calls. The co-responder program launched 8 months after the settlement was signed. In its first year of operation, it responded to 412 calls that would have previously been handled by officers alone. In 387 of those calls, the outcome was resolved without use of force. In 22 calls, the subject was transported directly to psychiatric care. In 3 calls, use of force was determined necessary by the clinician and officer jointly. 412 calls, 3 uses of force. Raymond Okafor was not at the press conference for the settlement announcement. He was not ready for that. His sister attended in his place and read a statement he had written from the psychiatric facility where he was still receiving treatment. The statement was short. It said that he had been sick on the night that the officer found him and that being sick was not a crime. He said he understood that the officer had not known. He said the problem was not that the officer had not known. The problem was that the officer had not stopped to ask. He said he hoped that the changes the city had agreed to make would mean that the next person who walked into a late-night store with their brain turning against them would encounter someone trained to ask the question before reaching for their belt. He said he was still working on getting better. He said he thought he was going to make it. Sandra Reeves still works the 11 to 7 shift at the Valero on Crescent Boulevard. She was interviewed by 3 journalists in the month after the footage was released and gave the same account each time without significant variation because it was simply what had happened and she had no reason to tell it differently. She said she had been trying to tell the officer from the moment she saw him coming through the glass. She said she did not blame herself for not stopping him because she had tried and she had not been able to, and there was a difference between those 2 things. She said she blamed the 4 hours. When asked what she meant, she said that an officer who had spent 4 hours learning about psychiatric crisis in 3 years of training was an officer who did not have enough to work with when a person in crisis came through a door at midnight. She said it was not about being a bad person. She said Brett Saunders might be a perfectly fine human being who simply was sent into a situation with tools that were not adequate for what the situation required. She said the city knew the tools were not adequate. She said they sent him anyway. Brett Saunders served his sentence. He was released after 19 months. He did not speak publicly. He did not contact Raymond Okafor or his family. His name is in the criminal record and the civil filing and the department's revised training curriculum, where the encounter is presented at the beginning of the expanded crisis intervention training module as the case that produced the module. Every officer who goes through that training watches the body cam footage. They watch Saunders move past Sandra Reeves in the doorway. They watch her mouth moving. And the training stops the footage at that moment and asks them what they would have done differently. The answer is simple.
The answer is 10 seconds. The answer is stop and turn and listen to the person standing in the doorway who has been in the room for 12 minutes and has information you do not have. 10 seconds. That is the distance between what happened and what could have happened. 10 seconds that Brett Saunders did not take. 10 seconds that Raymond Okafor is still living with. 10 seconds that the city of Tampa paid $1,600,000 to make sure the next officer understands are not optional. They are the job.